Tonight, we're stepping into the darker side of the human mind. A place where behavior shifts quietly, where decisions change without warning, and where simple situations reveal something deeper about who we are. These are not just stories, they are real experiments, real people, and real moments that uncovered how fragile and unpredictable the mind can be. So get comfortable, slow your breathing, and let yourself drift as we explore these dark psychology facts, one by one. Something inside people can change in just a few days, and no one notices until it is too late. In the summer of 1971, deep inside Stanford University in California, a quiet experiment began under the guidance of Philip Zimbardo, a psychology professor who wanted to understand how power shapes behavior. He turned the basement of the university into a small, controlled prison, with narrow cells, metal bars, and a sense of authority that felt real enough to believe. 24 young men volunteered, each one carefully screened to make sure they were mentally stable and physically healthy, ordinary students with no history of violence or instability. They were randomly divided into two groups, prisoners and guards, and from the very first moment, something subtle began to shift. The guards were given uniforms, dark sunglasses that hid their eyes, and simple wooden batons, small details that slowly separated them from their former identities. The prisoners were stripped of their names and given numbers, their clothes replaced with plain smocks, their individuality quietly removed. At first, it felt like a role, like a game they all understood, but by the second day, the atmosphere had changed in a way no one expected. The guards began to assert control, not because they were told to, but because they could, waking prisoners at night, forcing them to repeat their numbers, introducing small punishments that gradually became more intense. The prisoners started to respond, some becoming anxious, others withdrawn, and a few began to break down under the pressure, forgetting that they could leave at any time. One participant cried uncontrollably and had to be removed early, his sense of reality blurred by the environment around him. What is most unsettling is that the guards also changed, not all of them, but enough to show a pattern, as they became more strict, more distant, and sometimes cruel, without clear instruction to do so. Even Philip Zimbardo himself became absorbed in the situation, watching as both sides lost sight of the fact that it was only an experiment. It continued for 6 days before it was finally stopped, not because the plan was complete, but because someone outside the system saw what was happening and questioned it. Christina Maslach, a young psychologist, visited the basement and was disturbed by what she saw, asking a simple question that broke the illusion and forced Zimbardo to see the situation clearly again. The experiment ended early, but the results stayed, revealing something deeply uncomfortable about human nature, that under certain conditions, ordinary people can change quickly, slipping into roles that reshape how they think and act. The basement returned to silence, the uniforms were removed, and the students went back to their lives, but the question remained, quiet and persistent, waiting in the background of every situation involving power, control, and identity. How much of who we are is truly ours, and how much is shaped by the roles we are given? There is a moment when a person feels something is wrong, yet still chooses to continue, and that moment can be more common than we think. In 1961, at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram designed an experiment to explore how far people would go when instructed by an authority figure. Participants arrived believing they were taking part in a study about learning and memory, nothing unusual, nothing threatening, just a simple test involving questions and answers. Each participant was assigned the role of teacher, while another person, who was actually part of the experiment, played the learner in a separate room. The task was straightforward. The teacher would read questions, and if the learner answered incorrectly, they would receive an electric shock, starting at a low level and increasing with each mistake. The shocks were not real, but the participants believed they were, and that belief shaped everything that followed. As the experiment progressed, the learner began to protest, first with mild discomfort, then with louder complaints, and eventually with cries of pain, asking for the experiment to stop. At a certain point, the learner stopped responding altogether, leaving only silence on the other side of the wall. The participant, now alone with the decision, would often hesitate, showing signs of stress, sweating, trembling, or laughing nervously, unsure of what to do next. but standing nearby was a calm, composed experimenter in a lab coat, representing authority, who would gently insist that the participant continue, using simple phrases like "the experiment requires that you go on," or "you have no other choice." And in many cases, the participant obeyed. Over 60% of them continued to the highest level, delivering what they believed to be a dangerous, even fatal shock. These were not cruel individuals, they were ordinary people, individuals who likely saw themselves as kind and reasonable, yet in that setting, their sense of responsibility shifted. The presence of authority reduced their personal accountability, allowing them to continue even when they felt discomfort. After the experiment, many participants expressed shock at their own actions, unable to understand how they had gone so far. Milgram concluded that obedience to authority is deeply rooted in human behavior, shaped by social structures and expectations that guide our actions often without us realizing it. The experiment raised serious ethical concerns, as participants experience real stress and confusion, but it also revealed something important, that under certain conditions, the line between right and wrong can become blurred, not because people do not care, but because they are following a system they trust. The quiet realization that emerges from this study is not loud or dramatic, but it stays with you, that the capacity to obey, even when it feels wrong, may exist in more people than we would like to admit. Fear does not always come from danger, sometimes it is gently placed into the mind, where it grows without being noticed. In 1920, at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, a psychologist named John B. Watson set out to demonstrate that emotions could be learned through experience. He worked with a young child known only as Little Albert, a calm and curious infant who showed no fear of animals or unfamiliar objects. At the beginning of the experiment, Albert was presented with a white rat, and he reached out to touch it without hesitation, showing interest but no distress. This simple interaction was important. It showed that fear was not naturally present in this situation. Then the experiment changed. Each time Albert reached for the rat, Watson created a loud, sudden noise behind him by striking a metal bar with a hammer, a sharp sound that startled the child and caused him to cry. This pairing was repeated several times, the rat appearing, followed by the loud noise, linking the two experiences together. Over time, Albert began to associate the rat with the unpleasant sound, and eventually, the rat alone was enough to trigger fear. He cried at the sight of it, pulling away, his body reacting before he could understand why. What made the experiment more unsettling was that the fear did not remain limited to the rat. It spread to other similar objects, a rabbit, a dog, even a mask with soft white features, all began to produce the same reaction. The fear had generalized, extending beyond the original source into a broader pattern. Watson had shown that emotional responses could be conditioned, that something neutral could become frightening through repeated association. But the experiment did not include a way to remove the fear. No attempt was made to help Albert return to his original state, leaving the outcome unresolved. The identity of Little Albert remains uncertain, though some believe he may have been a child named Douglas Merritt, but the details are not fully clear. What remains clear is the impact of the experiment on how we understand fear, not as something fixed, but as something that can be shaped by experience. Today, this idea forms the basis for many psychological treatments, where learned fears can be slowly reduced through controlled exposure. But the quiet truth behind it all is simple and unsettling, that some of the fears we carry may not have begun with us, but were learned slowly, through moments we no longer remember, yet still feel. Silence can feel peaceful at first, but given enough time, it begins to press against the mind in ways that are difficult to ignore. In the mid-1950s, at McGill University in Montreal, a psychologist named Donald Hebb began a series of experiments to understand what happens when the brain is deprived of normal sensory input. Volunteers were invited to take part, mostly young men, offered payment in exchange for lying still in a controlled environment for extended periods. The setup seemed simple. Each participant was placed in a small room, lying on a bed, wearing goggles that blurred their vision into soft light without clear shapes, and their hands were covered so they could not properly feel textures. The room was quiet, almost completely silent, and they were instructed to remain there as long as they could. At first, the experience felt calm, almost relaxing, like drifting in a quiet space with nothing to do. But the human mind is not built for emptiness. It searches constantly for patterns, for stimulation, for something to hold on to. After several hours, boredom began to settle in, followed by restlessness, and then something stranger. Participants started to see things that were not there, simple shapes at first, flashes of light, moving shadows that had no source. As time passed, these hallucinations became more vivid, voices appeared, sounds with no origin, images that felt real despite the stillness of the room. Their thoughts became disorganized, concentration weakened, and even simple mental tasks became difficult. Many participants could not continue beyond 2 or 3 days, asking to leave the experiment early because the experience had become too overwhelming. What began as quiet had turned into something intense, not loud or chaotic, but deeply unsettling. The experiment revealed that the brain depends on external input to maintain stability, and when that input disappears, it begins to create its own reality. This discovery drew attention beyond academic research, especially during the Cold War, when governments began to consider how sensory deprivation might be used in interrogation. The idea was simple but troubling, that removing stimulation could weaken resistance without physical force. Over time, ethical concerns grew, and the experiments were criticized for the psychological strain they caused. Today, controlled forms of sensory deprivation exist, such as flotation tanks used for relaxation, but always within limits and with an understanding of their effects. The quiet lesson that remains is that silence is not always empty, and when the mind is left alone for too long without connection to the outside world, it does not stay still, it begins to fill the space in ways we may not expect. Time feels steady when we can see the world around us, but without those signals, it begins to slip quietly out of reach. In 1962, a French scientist named Michel Siffre entered a cave deep in the Alps with a simple but unusual goal: to live without any reference to time and observe how his body would respond. There were no clocks, no sunlight, no clear indication of day or night, only darkness and isolation. Siffre brought basic supplies, food, water, and equipment to communicate with a team above ground, but he had no way of knowing the actual time. At first, he tried to maintain a routine, sleeping and waking in what felt like normal cycles, but slowly, that rhythm began to drift. His days became longer, sometimes staying awake for over 30 hours, then sleeping for extended periods, all without realizing the change. To him, it felt natural, but in reality, his internal clock was shifting away from the standard 24-hour cycle. Weeks passed in the cave, though Siffre could not measure them accurately, and his sense of time became unreliable, days blending together, moments losing their structure. When researchers contacted him near the end of the experiment, he believed it was mid-August, but in reality, it was already September. He had spent 2 months underground, yet his perception of that time was shorter. The experiment showed that humans have an internal rhythm, but it is not perfectly aligned with the external world, and without cues like light and social interaction, it begins to drift. Siffre later repeated similar experiments, staying in isolation for even longer periods, confirming the same pattern each time. The results became important for understanding sleep, especially in environments where natural light is limited, such as space travel or polar regions. But beyond the scientific findings, the experience revealed something more subtle: that time is not just something we measure with clocks, it is something we feel, shaped by our surroundings. Without those surroundings, it becomes fluid, uncertain, almost abstract. The quiet disorientation Siffre experienced was not dramatic, but it was persistent, a gentle loss of structure that changed how he experienced reality. Today, his work reminds us that our sense of time depends on connection, to light, to routine, to other people, and without those anchors, it can quietly dissolve, leaving us drifting in a space where minutes and hours no longer hold the same meaning. Here was a time when some believed the human mind could be completely reset, as if thoughts and memories could simply be wiped away and replaced. In the 1950s, at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, a psychiatrist named Donald Ewan Cameron carried out a series of experiments that would later become some of the most controversial in psychological history. His goal was ambitious: to break down the existing patterns of the mind and rebuild them in a healthier form, a process he called psychic driving. Patients came to the institute seeking help for conditions like anxiety and depression, trusting that they would receive treatment, not knowing the extent of what would be done to them. Cameron used extremely high doses of electroconvulsive therapy, far beyond the standard practice at the time, sometimes administering multiple sessions in a single day. The intention was to disrupt existing thought patterns, to weaken the mind's current structure. After this, patients were often placed in prolonged states of sleep, kept unconscious for days or even weeks with medication. During this time, recorded messages were played repeatedly, simple phrases spoken over and over, intended to guide the mind toward new behaviors and beliefs. The idea was that once the mind had been reduced to a more basic state, it could be reshaped through repetition. But the results did not match the intention. Many patients experience severe memory loss, forgetting not only recent events but large parts of their lives, including basic skills and personal identities. Some had to relearn how to speak, how to recognize familiar people, how to function in daily life. The treatment did not rebuild the mind, it disrupted it in ways that could not be easily reversed. Years later, it was revealed that some of Cameron's work had been funded by the CIA as part of a secret program known as MK-Ultra, which aimed to explore methods of mind control. This connection raised further ethical concerns, as many participants had not given informed consent for such extreme procedures. Lawsuits followed, and the experiments became a symbol of how far research can go when ethical boundaries are not clearly defined. The idea of erasing the mind proved far more dangerous than expected, showing that memory and identity are deeply interconnected and not easily separated. Today, these experiments are remembered not for their success, but for the caution they represent, a reminder that the mind is not something that can be taken apart and rebuilt without consequence, and that in trying to control it completely, we may lose something essential that cannot be restored. Conflict can grow quietly, without warning, and sometimes it begins with nothing more than a simple division. In the summer of 1954, at a place called Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma, a psychologist named Muzafer Sherif organized a study that would reveal how easily people can turn against each other. 22 boys, all around 11 years old, arrived at the camp believing they were simply there for a summer experience, unaware that their interactions were being carefully observed. At first, they were divided into two separate groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers, each group unaware of the other's existence. Within their own groups, they bonded quickly, forming friendships, creating shared identities, and developing a sense of belonging that felt natural and comfortable. They chose names, built routines, and began to see themselves as part of something distinct. Then, the groups were introduced to each other, and competition was quietly added to the environment. Games were organized, with rewards for the winners and nothing for the losers, creating a clear sense of rivalry. At first, the interactions were light, small jokes and teasing, but gradually, the tone shifted. Insults appeared, followed by frustration, and then open hostility. The groups began to define themselves not just by who they were, but by who they were not. Us and them became the central idea, and with it came tension that grew stronger with each interaction. Flags were stolen and burned, cabins were raided, and arguments turned into physical fights. These were children who had shown no signs of aggression before, yet within days, they were deeply divided. The experiment showed how quickly group identity can take hold, shaping behavior in ways that feel justified from within the group but hostile from the outside. The researchers then attempted to reduce the conflict, first by bringing the groups together in neutral activities, but this did not work, as the division remained strong. It was only when they introduced shared challenges, problems that required cooperation, such as fixing a broken water supply or working together to move a heavy object, that the hostility began to fade. Slowly, the group started to interact differently, seeing each other not as enemies, but as partners in a common goal. By the end of the study, the boys who had once fought were sharing meals and choosing to travel home together. The experiment revealed something both simple and profound, that division can be created easily, but unity requires effort, shared purpose, and time. The quiet lesson it leaves behind is that the boundaries between us and others are often thinner than they appear, shaped not by who we are, but by how we are placed together. There are moments when help is needed, and yet no one moves, not because they do not care, but because something holds them back. In 1968, psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané at New York University began studying this quiet hesitation, inspired by a widely reported case involving a woman named Kitty Genovese in New York City. It was said that many people had heard her calls for help during an attack, yet no one intervened in time, a story that raised unsettling questions about human behavior. To understand this, Dali and Latane designed experiments where participants believed they were part of group discussions through an intercom system, each person isolated in their own room. During the session, one of the voices, actually a recording, began to show signs of distress, speaking with difficulty, saying that he was having a seizure and needed help. The situation felt real, the urgency clear, and the participants were left with a choice, to act or to wait. When participants believed they were the only ones listening, most responded quickly, leaving their rooms to seek help. But when they believed others were also present, the response changed. The more people they thought were involved, the less likely they were to act immediately. Responsibility seemed to spread across the group, becoming less personal, less urgent. This effect became known as the bystander effect, a pattern where individuals are less likely to help when others are present. It is not a lack of concern, but a quiet diffusion of responsibility, where each person assumes someone else will act. Doubt also plays a role, as people look to others for cues, and when no one reacts, the situation feels less clear, less defined. The experiments revealed that social context can influence decisions in subtle but powerful ways, shaping whether we step forward or remain still. Over time, this understanding led to changes in public awareness, encouraging people to take individual responsibility in emergencies, to recognize that waiting for others can delay action when it is needed most. The story of Kitty Genovese has since been re-examined, with details clarified and corrected, but the psychological insight remains. It reminds us that action is often a choice made in a moment, influenced by the presence of others, by uncertainty, by hesitation. The quiet truth is that in situations where help is needed, the difference between action and inaction can come down to a single decision, a single step forward, taken before the mind has time to wait. Not every experiment follows the path we expect, and sometimes, people respond in ways that challenge the very idea being tested. In 2002, a new prison study was conducted in the United Kingdom, known as the BBC Prison Study, led by psychologists Alex Haslam and Stephen Reiher. It was designed in part to revisit earlier findings about power and authority, but with more careful control and ethical oversight. Participants were assigned roles as guards and prisoners, placed in a controlled environment that resembled a prison, with cameras documenting their behavior over time. At the beginning, the guards held authority, expected to maintain order and establish control, while the prisoners were placed in a lower position within the structure. But something unexpected happened. The guards did not fully embrace their authority, they hesitated, uncertain about how to act, and struggled to enforce control in a consistent way. Without strong leadership or clear direction, their role remained unstable, lacking the confidence needed to dominate the environment. Meanwhile, the prisoners began to form a strong group identity, supporting each other, sharing experiences, and gradually challenging the structure around them. Instead of becoming passive, they became organized, questioning the legitimacy of the system and resisting its authority. The balance of power began to shift, not through force, but through collective action. Eventually, the system broke down, the guards lost control, and the original structure collapsed. A new system emerged, one based on shared decision-making, but even this proved unstable, as some participants began to consider more authoritarian forms of leadership again. The experiment ended early, not because of harm, but because the situation had become too complex to maintain within the study's design. The results challenged earlier assumptions, showing that power does not automatically lead to dominance, and that authority must be accepted by those it seeks to control. Without that acceptance, it weakens, loses its influence, and can be reshaped or rejected entirely. The study highlighted the importance of group identity, showing that people are not simply defined by the roles they are given, but by how they interpret and respond to those roles. It revealed that behavior is not fixed, but dynamic, influenced by relationships, beliefs, and shared understanding. The quiet message it leaves is that systems of power are not as solid as they seem, and that within any structure, there is always the possibility for change, shaped by the people inside it. Memory feels steady, like something we can return to whenever we want, but in quiet ways, it can shift without us noticing. In the 1990s, at the University of California, Irvine, a psychologist named Elizabeth Loftus began studying how memories are formed and how easily they can be influenced. Her work focused on a simple but unsettling idea, that people can come to believe in events that never actually happened. Participants were invited to take part in what seemed like a study about childhood memories, and they were given a set of stories, most of which were true, provided by family members. Hidden among these real events was one that was entirely false, often a story about being lost in a shopping mall as a child and later being helped by a stranger. At first, many participants did not recognize the false memory, saying they could not recall it. But as the study continued, they were gently encouraged to think about it, to imagine the details, to consider what it might have felt like. Over time, something began to change. Some participants started to remember the event, not as a possibility, but as something that had truly happened. They described details, emotions, even specific images, all of which had been created through suggestion rather than experience. The memory felt real because the mind had filled in the gaps, building a narrative that made sense within their personal history. Loftus showed that memory is not a perfect recording, it is a reconstruction, shaped by context, suggestion, and the passage of time. Each time we recall something, we are not simply retrieving it, we are rebuilding it, and in that process, it can change. This has important implications, especially in situations where memory is relied upon as evidence, such as in legal cases. Eyewitness testimony, once considered highly reliable, can be influenced by the way questions are asked or by exposure to new information. The quiet influence of suggestion can alter what people believe they saw or experienced. Loftus's work was not without controversy, as it raised ethical questions about planting false memories, even in a controlled setting. But it also provided a deeper understanding of how the mind works, showing that our sense of the past is more flexible than we might expect. The quiet thought that remains is that some of the memories we hold with confidence may not be as fixed as they seem, shaped over time by subtle influences we may never fully notice. There has always been a question about whether certain parts of human nature can be removed, whether empathy, the ability to feel for others, can be reduced or shaped by experience. In the mid-20th century, researchers began exploring this idea through the study of behavior and personality. A psychiatrist named Hervey Cleckley, working in the United States, described individuals who appeared normal on the surface, intelligent and socially capable, yet lacking a deeper emotional connection. He referred to this pattern as psychopathy, a condition marked by a reduced capacity for empathy and emotional depth. Later, a psychologist named Robert Hare developed methods to measure these traits more systematically, identifying patterns of behavior that were consistent across different individuals. While these studies did not involve a single controlled experiment aimed at creating such traits, they raised questions about how environment and experience might influence emotional development. Observations of children raised in neglectful conditions showed that the absence of consistent care and emotional connection could affect how they related to others. In some cases, these children displayed reduced emotional responses, difficulty forming relationships, and a sense of detachment that carried into adulthood. Researchers considered whether certain environments could shape these traits, reinforcing behaviors that minimized empathy while encouraging self-focused actions. However, the results were not simple or predictable. Not all individuals exposed to such conditions developed the same patterns, suggesting that biological factors also play a role. The idea of deliberately creating a mind without empathy proved far more complex than expected, and ethical concerns prevented direct experimentation in this area. The question remained open, balanced between nature and nurture, between what we are born with and what we experience. Over time, the focus shifted from trying to create such traits to understanding and managing them, developing ways to identify and respond to these patterns in clinical settings. The quiet realization that emerges is that empathy is not just a fixed trait, but something that can be influenced by both internal and external factors, shaped over time in ways that are not always visible. Sanity seems like something clear and easy to recognize, but under certain conditions, it can become difficult to define. In 1973, at Stanford University, a psychologist named David Rosenhan conducted an experiment that would challenge how mental illness is diagnosed. He and several volunteers, all of whom were mentally healthy, visited psychiatric hospitals and reported a single symptom, hearing a voice that said simple words like empty or hollow. Apart from this one statement, they behaved normally, speaking clearly, answering questions honestly, and showing no other signs of distress. Despite this, they were admitted into the hospitals and given diagnoses such as schizophrenia. Once inside, they stopped reporting any symptoms and continued to act as they normally would. However, their behavior was interpreted through the lens of their diagnosis. Ordinary actions were seen as signs of illness, writing notes became compulsive behavior, waiting quietly became withdrawal. The label assigned to them shaped how they were perceived, making it difficult for staff to see their behavior objectively. Interestingly, some real patients in the hospitals questioned whether the volunteers were actually ill, suggesting that the distinction between patient and observer was not as clear as expected. The volunteers remained in the hospitals for varying lengths of time, trying to convince the staff that they were well, but their statements were often dismissed. Eventually, they were discharged, not as healthy individuals, but with the note that their condition was in remission. Rosenhan's findings raised important questions about the reliability of psychiatric diagnosis and the influence of context on perception. The study suggested that once a label is applied, it can shape how all subsequent behavior is interpreted, making it difficult to see beyond it. The results led to changes in how mental health is approached, encouraging more careful evaluation and awareness of bias. The quiet message that remains is that identity is not only something we carry within ourselves, but also something shaped by how others see us, and under certain conditions, that perception can become stronger than reality itself. Hunger does not only affect the body, it slowly reshapes the mind in ways that are difficult to notice until they take hold. In the early 1940s, during the Second World War, a study began at the University of Minnesota under the direction of Ansel Keys, a physiologist who wanted to understand the effects of starvation. 36 men volunteered, all healthy and mentally stable, agreeing to live under strict dietary conditions for several months. The study was divided into phases, beginning with a period of normal eating, followed by a long phase of semi-starvation, where their daily calorie intake was significantly reduced. Their meals became simple and repetitive, consisting of basic foods like bread, potatoes, and thin soups, enough to survive but not enough to feel satisfied. At first, the changes were physical: weight loss, fatigue, slower movement, but gradually, the psychological effects became more noticeable. The men began to think about food constantly, talking about it, reading about it, collecting recipes, even watching others eat with a quiet fascination. Their mood shifted, irritability increased, concentration weakened, and tasks that once felt simple became more difficult. Some withdrew from social interaction, preferring silence over conversation, while others became restless or anxious. The experience was not dramatic, but it was persistent, a steady change that affected how they thought, felt, and behaved. When the starvation phase ended and food was reintroduced, the recovery was not immediate. The body needed time to adjust, but so did the mind, and some participants developed complicated relationships with food, overeating, or feeling anxious about meals. The study provided valuable information that helped with post-war relief efforts, guiding how to safely reintroduce food to populations affected by famine. But it also revealed something deeper, that basic needs are closely tied to mental well-being, and when those needs are not met, the mind adapts in ways that can be difficult to reverse. The quiet lesson it leaves is that the boundary between physical and psychological experience is not as clear as it seems, and that even something as simple as hunger can shape the way we see the world. Belief can remain steady even when reality moves in a different direction, holding its place quietly within the mind. In 1954, in the city of Chicago, a small group of people gathered around a shared conviction that the world would soon end in a great flood. Their belief came from a woman named Dorothy Martin, who claimed to receive messages from beings beyond Earth, warning of the coming event. A psychologist named Leon Festinger became interested in this group, not to test the prophecy, but to observe what would happen when a strong belief was challenged by reality. Festinger and his colleagues joined the group, quietly observing their actions and conversations as the predicted date approached. Members prepared for the event in different ways, some leaving their jobs, others distancing themselves from family, all waiting for a rescue that would take them away before the disaster. The night of the prediction arrived, and the group gathered, hopeful and anxious, watching the clock as time passed. Midnight came and went, and nothing happened: no flood, no rescue, only the quiet continuation of the ordinary world. At that moment, the belief faced a conflict with reality, creating a state of discomfort that Festinger described as cognitive dissonance. Some members responded by leaving the group, accepting that the prediction had failed. But others chose a different path. They adjusted their belief, suggesting that their faith had prevented the disaster, that their actions had saved the world. This shift allowed them to maintain their conviction without abandoning it, resolving the tension between expectation and reality. Festinger's study showed that belief is not easily broken, especially when it is tied to identity and community. When faced with contradiction, the mind may adapt the belief rather than discard it, preserving a sense of consistency. This pattern can be seen in many areas of life, not just in extreme cases, but in everyday situations where we hold onto ideas even when they are challenged. The quiet realization is that belief is not only about evidence, but also about meaning, and sometimes, letting go of a belief can feel more difficult than reshaping it to fit the world as it is. Connection is not something we simply enjoy, it is something we need, and without it, something essential begins to fade. In the 1950s, at the University of Wisconsin, a psychologist named Harry Harlow conducted a series of studies that would change how we understand attachment. He worked with infant monkeys, separating them from their mothers and placing them in controlled environments where they were given two artificial figures. One was made of wire and provided milk, the basic requirement for survival, while the other was covered in soft cloth and offered no food, only a sense of comfort. The expectation might have been that the monkeys would stay close to the source of nourishment, but the results showed something different. The infant spent most of their time with the cloth figure, seeking its softness and warmth, returning to it even when they needed food. When they were frightened, they ran to the cloth figure, holding onto it as if it could provide safety. This behavior suggested that comfort and emotional connection are as important as physical needs, perhaps even more so in certain moments. The absence of real maternal care had lasting effects on the monkeys. Many developed unusual behaviors, rocking back and forth, avoiding social interaction, or showing signs of distress. When they were later introduced to other monkeys, they struggled to connect, their early experiences shaping how they interacted with the world. These findings were later reflected in human studies, where children raised in environments lacking consistent care showed similar difficulties in forming relationships and managing emotions. Harlow's work was controversial, raising ethical concerns about the treatment of the animals, but it also highlighted an important truth, that love and connection are not optional, they are fundamental to development. The quiet message that remains is that the presence or absence of care in early life can shape who we become in ways that are not always visible, but deeply felt. Hope is not something we can touch, yet it can quietly decide how long we keep going. In the early 1960s, a researcher named Kurt Richter at Johns Hopkins University began observing something unusual while studying endurance in animals. His work involved placing rats in containers of water and watching how long they could swim before giving up. At first, the results seemed predictable. The rats struggled for a short time, searching for escape, and then eventually stopped, sinking beneath the surface. But then Richter changed one small detail. Just before the rats reached their limit, he lifted them out of the water for a brief moment, allowing them to rest, to breathe, to recover slightly, and then he placed them back again. What followed was unexpected. The same rats, which had previously given up quickly, now continued swimming for much longer periods, far beyond what they had done before. Their physical condition had not changed significantly, but something else had. They had experienced rescue, even if only for a moment, and that experience seemed to alter their expectation. Instead of seeing the situation as endless and hopeless, they continued with the quiet belief that something might change again. This observation led to a deeper reflection on human behavior, especially in situations of extreme stress or uncertainty. Studies of people in difficult conditions, whether in isolation, survival situations, or prolonged hardship, have shown a similar pattern. Those who maintain a sense of hope, even a small one, often endure longer, finding ways to continue where others might stop. Hope does not remove the difficulty, but it changes how the mind responds to it. Without it, the same situation can feel heavier, more final, more difficult to continue. Richter's work, while conducted with animals, pointed toward something broader, that endurance is not only physical, but deeply psychological. The quiet presence of possibility, the idea that something might improve, can extend effort in ways that are not immediately visible. At the same time, the absence of hope can lead to a quicker sense of defeat, even when the body is still capable. Over time, this idea has influenced how resilience is understood, shaping approaches in therapy, recovery, and support systems that aim to preserve a sense of possibility. The quiet lesson is that hope does not need to be loud or certain. It can exist as a small, steady feeling, enough to carry someone forward for a little longer, and sometimes, that is all that is needed. There are moments when doing what we are told feels natural, almost automatic, yet those same moments can quietly lead us somewhere unexpected. In 1966, at a hospital in the United States, a psychiatrist named Charles Hoffling conducted an experiment to examine how authority influences decision-making in real settings. Nurses working their regular shifts received a phone call from someone who identified himself as a doctor, a figure of authority within the hospital environment. The voice gave a clear instruction to administer a specific medication to a patient, but the dosage requested exceeded the safe limit and went against established hospital rules. There were warning labels on the medication, clear guidelines about proper procedure, and a standard requirement that such orders should be written and verified. Despite these safeguards, many nurses prepared to follow the instruction. The situation was not dramatic, there was no visible pressure, only the presence of authority communicated through a voice and a title. In total, a large majority of the nurses moved toward carrying out the order, stopping only when the experiment was interrupted before any harm could occur. The result was not a reflection of carelessness, but of how deeply ingrained obedience can be, especially in structured environments where roles and hierarchies are clearly defined. The nurses were trained professionals, capable and responsible, yet in that moment, the expectation to follow authority overrode their usual judgment. Hoffeling's study revealed that obedience is not always a conscious decision, it can operate as a learned response, shaped by experience and reinforced by systems that value compliance. This insight led to changes in medical training, encouraging more active questioning and verification, emphasizing that authority should not replace critical thinking. The quiet realization is that following orders can feel like the safest path, but there are moments when safety depends on pausing, on noticing, on choosing not to continue without reflection. Morality often feels like something clear and stable, yet in certain moments, it becomes uncertain, shaped by how we see a situation rather than by fixed rules. In the late 20th century, philosophers and psychologists explored this uncertainty through scenarios designed to reveal how people make moral decisions. One of the most well-known ideas came from Philippa Foot and was later expanded by Judith Jarvis Thompson, presenting a situation that has come to be known as the trolley problem. The scenario is simple in structure: a runaway trolley is heading toward 5 people who cannot escape, and you stand near a lever that can divert it onto another track where only one person is present. The decision seems straightforward: redirecting the trolley would reduce the number of lives lost, and many people say they would choose to pull the lever. But when the situation changes slightly, the response often changes as well. Imagine standing on a bridge above the track, next to a single person whose presence could stop the trolley if pushed, saving the 5 below. The outcome is the same in numbers, 1 life for 5, yet the emotional response is different, and many people hesitate or refuse to act. Researchers studying these responses have found that different areas of the brain are engaged depending on how the situation is presented, suggesting that moral decisions are influenced by both reasoning and emotion. The distance from the action, the level of personal involvement, and the way the choice is framed all affect how it feels and how it is judged. There is no single correct answer within these scenarios, only a reflection of how individuals balance outcomes, intentions, and emotional responses. This quiet conflict within morality shows that ethical decisions are not purely logical, they are shaped by context and perception. The lesson is not about finding a definitive rule, but about understanding the complexity of how we think about right and wrong, and how those thoughts can shift depending on how we experience a situation. Being alone can feel peaceful for a while, but when that silence stretches too far, it begins to change the way the mind moves. In the mid-20th century, researchers began exploring the effects of isolation more deeply, and one of the central figures in this work was John C. Lilly, a neuroscientist who studied sensory deprivation using specially designed flotation tanks. These tanks were filled with warm water, kept at body temperature, and enclosed to block out light and sound, creating an environment where external stimulation was almost completely removed. Participants would float in this space, weightless, with nothing to focus on except their own thoughts. At first, many described the experience as calming, a chance to disconnect from the outside world and rest in a quiet, uninterrupted state. But as time passed, the absence of sensory input began to have unexpected effects. Without external signals to guide the mind, thoughts became more vivid, sometimes drifting into images or sounds that were not actually present. Some participants reported seeing patterns, hearing voices, or feeling a sense of movement despite being still. The brain, it seemed, was trying to fill the silence, creating its own stimulation when none was available. Beyond these experiences, longer periods of isolation showed deeper changes. People began to lose track of time, their sleep patterns shifted, and their sense of reality became less stable. Emotions could intensify or fade, leading to feelings of anxiety, confusion, or detachment. These findings drew attention not only in psychology but also in other fields, particularly during times when isolation was used as a method of control or interrogation. The idea that removing interaction and stimulation could affect the mind without physical force raised important ethical questions. Modern research has confirmed that prolonged isolation can impact mental health, affecting cognition, emotional stability, and even physical well-being. Humans are inherently social, and connection plays a role in maintaining psychological balance. Without it, the mind does not simply rest, it adapts, sometimes in ways that are difficult to reverse. Today, while controlled forms of isolation are used for relaxation or therapeutic purposes, they are carefully limited and monitored. The quiet understanding that remains is that solitude and isolation are not the same, and while a brief moment alone can be calming, extended disconnection can slowly reshape how we think, feel, and experience the world around us. Not every influence on the mind is obvious, and some of the most powerful ones happen quietly, without drawing attention to themselves. Throughout the 20th century, researchers became increasingly interested in how thoughts, decisions, and behaviors could be influenced by subtle changes in environment and suggestion. One of the most controversial areas of this research emerged through programs such as MK Ultra, a series of secret projects associated with the CIA that aimed to explore the limits of psychological influence. These experiments, conducted in various locations, often involved methods such as the use of psychoactive substances, sleep disruption, and repeated messaging, all intended to observe how the mind could be affected under controlled conditions. Participants were sometimes aware they were part of a study, but in other cases, they were not fully informed, raising serious ethical concerns. The goal was not always clearly defined, but it centered around understanding whether thoughts could be guided, altered, or controlled. The results did not produce a simple method of control, but they revealed something more subtle, that the mind can be influenced in ways that are not immediately noticeable. Beyond these controversial studies, everyday research has shown similar patterns on a smaller scale. The way a question is asked can change how it is answered, the environment we are in can shape our decisions, and repeated exposure to certain ideas can make them feel more familiar and acceptable. This process, often called suggestion or priming, operates quietly, guiding thought without direct awareness. It is not control in the absolute sense, but it is influence, steady and persistent. Over time, these insights have been applied in fields such as marketing, communication, and behavioral science, where understanding how people make decisions can help shape messages more effectively. The important distinction that remains is between influence and control, one working with the natural processes of the mind, the other attempting to override them. The history of these experiments serves as a reminder of how delicate the balance can be, and how easily it can be disrupted when boundaries are not respected. The quiet thought that lingers is that while we experience our thoughts as our own, they are often shaped by a network of influences that operate beneath awareness, guiding us in ways we may never fully see. And now, we've reached the quiet end of our journey. You've moved gently through stories that live in the hidden corners of the human mind, where behavior shifts, where perception bends, and where reality is not always as steady as it seems. Each moment we explored was a small window into something deeper, something that reminds us how complex and delicate the mind truly is. Some of these stories may stay with you, while others may simply drift away, fading softly into the background. That's perfectly all right. There's nothing you need to hold on to. Just let the thoughts settle, slowly and naturally, like dust in still air. As your mind begins to quiet, allow your body to follow, releasing tension without effort, without thought. You don't need to understand everything, and you don't need to reach any conclusions. Just rest in the calm that comes after curiosity. If you enjoyed this quiet space, you can always return. There will always be another gentle path to follow, another story waiting in the dark. But for now, let everything soften. Let your breathing slow. And let yourself drift, quietly and peacefully, into rest.